3. The power to detect danger. For thieves and others with detection abilities, this was one of the most important skills, and it did exactly what it sounded like. There were two ways to detect danger. One was sensing a threat immediately without deduction or examination, and the other was accomplished by using deduction based on experience and examination. If a bad feeling was an example of the former, then reading slight changes in the environment, a faint smell or noise, was an example of the latter. The latter was sometimes strengthened without even trying, by going to battle or traveling solo. It was an experience that came of placing oneself near danger. And in most cases, creatures like lizardmen were better at it than humans. It was a biological ability that stemmed from their keen sense organs and cruel environment. Humans got to sleep in a safe place away from monsters, but in the lizardmen's habitat, the monsters were right next door. It was especially easy for the lone wanderer Zardayusu to catch shifts in the atmosphere outdoors. Sensing something like tension in the air, Zardayusu popped his eyes open. The familiar scenery of his room, although he'd been sleeping there for only a handful of nights, filled his field of vision. A human wouldn't have been able to see even if they'd squinted in this room with no light, but it wasn't so hard for a lizardman.
Nothing out of the ordinary?
Having scanned the room to confirm that, he breathed a faint sigh of relief and shifted. Because he was such a brilliant warrior, even though he had just been asleep, he was as awake as ever. Not only was he not groggy, but his body was ready to jump into battle at a moment's notice. This was partly due to how lightly Lizardman slept, but Krush, lying next to him, showed no signs of waking. She just emitted a disgruntled cry in her sleep at the loss of Zardayusu's warmth. Normally, Krush would have felt the change in the atmosphere and woken up as well, but it seemed like this time she couldn't. Zardayusu felt just a bit bad, that maybe he'd put too big a burden on her. He recalled the previous night and concluded that maybe her load had been bigger. From defeating the Elder Lich and everything afterward, it must have been harder on her as a female. Personally, he wanted to let her sleep, but if he listened carefully, he could hear the sounds of lizardmen rushing around outside. Letting her sleep during an emergency might end up being more dangerous.
Krush.
Krush! He shook her rather forcefully a couple of times. Her tail twisted up, and right away her red eyes showed themselves. Huh?
Something's happened.
With that, her eyes opened fully, even though she still wanted to sleep. Zardayusu grabbed Frostpain from its position nearby and stood up. Krush followed a moment later. When they went outside, they saw immediately what had caused the disturbance. A black cloud spread thickly over the village. It was clear immediately from a glance into the distance that this was no normal cloud. The rest of the sky was fair and blue. In short, it was...
They're here. Again?
A sign that their enemy had returned.
Seems that way,
Krush agreed. The lizardmen of the 5 tribes who had fought together had also all noticed the cloud and were making a racket, but there was no sign of fear. The victory against overwhelming odds in the battle of the previous day had strengthened their hearts. Zardayusu and Krush splashed toward the main gate at a sprint. They passed by a few lizardmen preparing for combat and reached the gate fairly quickly. Many warriors had already gathered, keeping a close watch on the outside. Zenbel was also there. Next to him was the Small-Fang chief. Zenbel raised a hand in greeting to the two loudly sloshing over, and jerked his chin at the scene outside the gate. Zardayusu and Krush stood next to him and peered beyond the gate. On the opposite shore, on the boundary between the marsh and the forest, were ranks of skeletons.
They're back.
Yeah, Zardayusu replied to Zenbel and clicked his tongue. He'd expected this, but it was too soon. Their calculation that it would take some time to recover from such a heavy loss had been completely off. He was surprised they had the power to mobilize an army this big again.
At least they're probably weaker than the skeletons that Elder Lich summoned.
Reading between the lines, that meant that Zenbel thought these skeletons were stronger than the army from before. Zardayusu took a close look at the skeletons too, to see how strong they were, to see how careful the lizardmen needed to be against them. The enemies were certainly all skeletons, but they were definitely different from last time. What had changed the most visually was their gear. The previous skeletons had had only rusty swords. These skeletons were very well outfitted. Also, maybe it was just in his head, but they even appeared to have better physiques. It seemed like there were 3 types, each with different gear. The most numerous wore splendid breastplates, carried shields shaped like a stretched-out inverted triangle, kite shields, in one hand, and held various weapons in the other. On their backs were quivers and composite longbows. They were well prepared for close or long-range fighting. The next type had ratty crimson capes flapping behind them over the same breastplate, held round shields and bastard swords, and wore helmets. Finally, the least numerous type had the most complete gear sets. They wore full plate armor with a magnificent golden gleam and clutched shining lances. Their eye-poppingly crimson capes seemed free of the slightest speck of dirt. After his initial observations, Zardayusu realized something, and unable to believe his eyes, he rubbed them a few times with his hands. But it was still there, the truth.
What? No way!
That's ridiculous.
Zardayusu released a pained murmur at the same time as Krush's surprised gasp. They'd realized the same thing. Then Zenbel reacted.
Yep, you noticed it too, huh?
His voice was pained like the others.
Yeah.
Zardayusu closed his mouth. He didn't want to say it, because that would just make it worse, but he had to.
Those look like magic weapons, don't they?
Krush, next to him, nodded. All the weapons the skeletons had were enchanted. One had a sword imbued with fire, another a hammer with blue lightning. There was one holding a spear with a glowing green tip, and even one with a sickle that seemed to be coated in purple goop.
That's not all. Take a closer look at their armor and shields. They're all magic.
Zardayusu squinted. Then he groaned in spite of himself. Their glowing wasn't reflected light, but something inside the objects themselves.
How much power do you need to equip that many skeleton soldiers with magic gear?
Certainly, if the magic was just to make blades sharper, the larger countries Zardayusu had heard of could probably do it if they planned ahead of time. But to imbue each of the weapons with its own attribute, all different kinds of effects, was a different story. Zardayusu remembered the stories of the dwarves he'd heard from Zenbel the other day. Dwarves were a mountain race with exceptional metalworking abilities. When they sat down to drink, the sagas they told contained stories of the king who built the great dwarven empire, a hero shrouded in adamantite armor who killed a dragon at the end of a one-on-one fight, one of the 13 heroes, magic mechanic. Even in those tales, there were no armies. Certainly not one of more than 5,000, outfitted with that much magic gear. So what was Zardayusu seeing?
A mythical army.
If it wasn't in the stories of the people, it had to be from the stories of the gods. Zardayusu shook with a single intense shudder. This was completely beyond his expectations. They'd made an enemy out of someone they shouldn't have. Still, he had gathered everyone here, fully aware that they might be wiped out. Could the one who'd come up with such a cruel plan be afraid now? Their enemy was unimaginably strong. He knew that. The question was what to do about it.
That can't be real. It has to be an illusion.
For a split second, everyone there asked the same wordless question. What are you talking about? The skeletons were maintaining a completely motionless stance, but they seemed distinctly substantial, and their presence was powerful enough to give one the chills. They couldn't be anything so flimsy as an illusion. The confusing thing was that the one who'd said it was the Small Fang chief. He definitely hadn't gone crazy.
What basis do you have for saying that?
He confidently responded to Zardayusu's question.
We've been sending scouts out on rotation. None of them saw any undead like that, and it's not like they could have just overlooked that many. All the scouts have come back safe, too. I see, but it sure doesn't seem like an illusion to me. But, well, maybe not. But if it's not, then they must have tunneled their way here. That would explain why we didn't see them. I don't care if they tunneled or flew. What are we gonna do? They don't seem to want to start a fight right away, but I don't get the feeling they came here to negotiate. Yeah, if it's like last time, they'll make some kind of move.
Zaryusu stared at the skeletons. He was trying to make out who the commander was when a shivery wind blew past him. It wasn't just one gust. The wind kept blowing. He was positive the strange, abrupt chill was no natural phenomenon, but brought about by magic.
The wind is... Huh? No way. It's a different spell? But it can't be.
Krush shivered, hugging her body. Her reaction wasn't just from the cold, which was why Zaryusu asked,
Krush, where did this freezing wind come from?
You might not believe me, but listen, Zaryusu. Up until now, I thought the change in the weather was caused by the Tier 4 spell Control Cloud. But it's not. Control Cloud can manipulate clouds, but it can't create a cold wind like this. That means the power isn't manipulating clouds, but changing the weather and climate. In other words, someone cast the Tier 6 spell Control Weather. At least, that's what I think, she added in a voice so small no one could hear. I don't know for sure, since it's a realm of magic I can't use myself.
Zaryusu knew how awesome the power of the 6th tier was. Even Aiguva, the most powerful enemy he'd faced since taking up a sword, couldn't use it. It was the supreme tier, said to be the highest in the world.
Is this the power of the Great One, or whoever? That definitely makes sense.
Calling someone who can use Tier 6 magic great was not an exaggeration.
Whoa, everybody and their brother is bumming out.
Zenbel's complaint was an apt description of the atmosphere. This weather was unseasonably cold. That is, their environment had changed in an impossible way. The Lizardmen's morale was dropping sharply. Last time it had just been the appearance of a cloud. They could deal with this degree of cold by building a bonfire and having the priests perform a ritual, but the autumn wind had taught the Lizardmen that their opponents had the power to warp nature, the uncontrollable. They didn't need to hear Krush's explanation to understand the immense power of their enemy. The wind nipping at them said it all.
Those bastards, they're on the move.
Zaryusu ground his teeth. His tail was trying to flail, but he willed it not to.
Are you really going to do that now?
When the orderly rows of skeletons began marching forward with precisely measured steps, the warrior lizardmen grew agitated, and some made warning growls. But Zaryusu, observing their movements, made a different judgment.
Those aren't combat movements.
Just when Zaryusu and Zenbel raised their voices to calm down the shaken lizardmen,
"Calm down!"
a jarring shout ripped through the air. Everyone turned to see Shishiryu.
I'll say it again. Calm down.
A silence fell, and the only sound was his confident, dignified voice.
And don't be afraid, warriors. Don't do anything that would disappoint the many ancestral spirits behind you.
He wove his way through the quiet lizardmen and stood next to Zaryusu.
What are they up to, Zaryusu? Brother, they're on the move, but it doesn't look like combat prep.
The marching skeletons formed 10 rows of 500.
What are they planning to do?
As if they'd been waiting for the question, the skeletons began to advance again. With perfect control, the rows parted to the left and right from the middle. Not a single skeleton out of place. Between the two sides, they left about a 20-skeleton gap. In that space, there was a lone figure. The shape wasn't all that big. Even at a distance of 250 yards, Zaryusu could tell it was smaller than him. It wore a raven-black robe and gave off an ominous, evil aura. Its resemblance to the elder lich they had fought the previous day suggested it was a caster. There was, however, one very different thing about this one, and that was its strength. When he saw it, ice crept up Zaryusu's spine. He knew instinctively that the difference in power between the elder lich of yesterday and this thing was like the difference between a toddler and a warrior. It gushed a frigid evil from its entire being. He could feel it even at this distance. And that wasn't all. Its gear was also on another level. An absolute ruler had appeared in the form of inescapable death.
The ruler of death?
Zaryusu surprised even himself as he uttered the most fitting words for the monster. And he'd hit the nail on the head. It was truly the Lord who ruled over death.
Oh!
What was the ruler of death going to do? The Lizardmen, watching with bated breath, all simultaneously shouted in surprise. A magic circle about 10 yards across had suddenly spread out around the caster as a huge dome. It gave off a pale blue glow, and patterns like translucent letters or symbols appeared on it. These characters changed at a dizzying rate. The same pattern didn't linger for even an instant. The way the pale light kept shifting as it illuminated the area was fantastic, and if it hadn't been the work of their enemy, they probably would have been captivated. Now, though, they weren't at all.
What is that?
Not comprehending what he was seeing, Zaryusu was confused. He'd never seen a huge dome projected into the air like that when a caster used magic. The action his opponent was taking was entirely outside the realm of his knowledge, so he asked the female who probably knew the most about magic out of anyone there.
What in the world is that?
I don't know. I have no idea what it is,
she replied, sounding scared. Apparently, she was especially frightened precisely because she knew about magic and still couldn't recognize the spell. The moment after he was about to calm her, perhaps the spell was cast, the dome burst and countless sparks of light whirled up into the air. All at once they spread across the sky as if they were exploding, and the lake froze. Not a single lizardman present understood what had happened. Not the uncommonly able tribal chief Shishoryu, not the brilliant priest Krush, not the experienced traveler Zaryusu. Even these lizardmen, with faculties matchless throughout all lizardman history, couldn't immediately comprehend what had taken place. It was so outrageous. They couldn't comprehend how their feet were below the ice. Moments later, after their brains had processed what had just happened before their eyes, the screams went up. Every lizardman, yes, all of them, shrieked. Even Zaryusu, Krush and Shishoryu, and even the one who probably had the most courage, Zenbel. They lost themselves in a fear that welled from the bottom of their hearts and climbed straight out of their souls to manifest in a scream. It was a reality too horrible. The lake that had never iced over, the lake that had never changed ever since they were born, had warped and frozen. The lizardmen panicked and pulled their legs up. Luckily, since the ice wasn't too thick, it broke right away, but it immediately refroze. The chill coming from below, that biting cold, proved they weren't seeing things. Flustered, Zaryusu hopped up on a mud wall and surveyed the scene, and the view left him speechless. Everything in his field of vision was frozen. Certainly the entire lake couldn't be frozen, but it was a fact that as far as his eyes could see, everything was covered in ice. In a corner of his mind, worries about his fish preserve popped up, but now wasn't the time. Krush had hopped next to Zaryusu, and when she surveyed the area, her jaw fell open just like his. The voice from her agape mouth sounded like her soul had left her.
No way.
Zaryusu didn't want to believe it either.
You monster!
he barked, hoping it would ease the fear.
Get up now!
Shishoryu's roar echoed. Several lizardmen had collapsed. The members of the warrior caste who were all right worked together to pull them out of the frozen marsh. All the lizardmen being pulled were pale in the face and trembling. The rising chill was probably sapping their life force.
Brother, I'm going to go check around the village.
Zaryusu had frost pain, so this level of chill wouldn't affect him.
No, don't go. Why not? They're probably going to make their move. I won't let you leave us now. Keep an eye on the enemy. I forbid you to miss a single thing. You've traveled the world and have all sorts of knowledge. You're the Lizardman for this job.
Shifting his gaze from Zaryusu, Shishouryu called out to the warriors in the area.
I'm going to cast the chill defense spell, Ice Energy Protection. Go around the village and tell everyone to stay away from the ice.
I'll cast too.
Great. Then you and I will split up the work. If you see anyone in trouble, cast a healing spell on them.
Krush and Shishouryu managed to safely begin casting the protective magic on the lizardmen. Zaryusu stayed up on the mud wall with his keen gaze aimed at the enemy line so as not to miss a single move. He had to do exactly what his brother told him.
Whoop!
Zenbel hopped up on the wall next to him and checked the enemy lines in an easygoing way.
Take it a little easier. Your brother, he's just like that, right? Has high expectations of your know-how. Even if you miss something, he's not gonna get mad. More importantly, if you focus too hard, your field of vision will shrink.
Zenbel's unconcerned voice was soothing. It was just like in the fight with the Elder Lich. Everyone needed to do what they could, and they would add all their efforts together. Zaryusu looked around and saw that warriors had also jumped up on the wall to observe the enemy. No, he wasn't fighting alone. He was fighting with a great many friends. It seemed like he'd been shaken up in the face of such overwhelming power by that display of magic. Zaryusu exhaled, like he was breathing out something that had festered in his heart.
Sorry. It's fine. But yeah, you're here too. Don't expect much in the brains department.
They laughed a bit together as they watched the enemy's movements.
But yeesh, those are some serious monsters. Yeah, they're on another level.
The King of Death, arrogant yet impressive like a true king, was eyeing the Lizardman village. His body should have been small, but it seemed to have swelled dozens of times larger.
That's gotta be the guy they call the Great One. Probably. I don't want to believe that they have more than one monster who can use magic powerful enough to freeze the lake. Seriously. I get it. To monsters who can do this kind of stuff, we lizardmen must be like little specks of dirt. Shit. We're no better than worms. Oh, he's moving.
The caster who had frozen the river raised his free hand and waved toward the village.
It must be a signal.
Zaryusu's hunch came true in horrifying fashion directly after that.
Ah!
Voices cried out here and there throughout the village.
What is that? What the heck is that?
Nothing could surprise him anymore, or so Zaryusu had thought, but what he saw made him practically shriek involuntarily. What stood before them was a giant statue with 2 arms and legs that appeared to be made out of stone. A red light, pulsing like a heartbeat, shone through from the bedrock of its thick chest. Solid arms, solid legs. Its squat body might have even been rather cute, if the thing hadn't stood almost 100 feet tall. That gigantic statue had suddenly appeared out of the forest. At this point, believing it was an illusion made more sense. The giant statue moved slowly, raising up a huge boulder from who knows where. Then the hulking creature threw it. Zaryusu instinctively covered his face. All those in the gigantic stone's path would surely die. In the darkness their world had become, Zardayusu was struck at once by a tremendous rumbling and a sound like an explosion. The wall beneath him swayed intensely, creaking, along with a roar like heavy rain, the kicked-up dirt falling back to the ground. From the village came the cries of not only children but adults as well. Despite having braced themselves, they were unable to withstand this fear that was beyond anything they could have imagined. Even though they'd made it through the previous battle, this was enough to regress them to small children. Relieved he had his life, Zardayusu timidly opened his eyes to see the undead army beginning to move. The giant statue was gone. They approached the newly fallen huge stone, lying in the marsh about midway between the two groups, held their flat shields over their heads, and crouched down. More skeletons, nimbly keeping their balance, got up on the shields of the first ones, then held their own shields up in the same way. Zardayusu shook like he'd been struck by lightning when he understood what they were doing.
Are they building stairs? Who uses troops that would inspire songs of praise and legends to build stairs?
They worked toward the top of the rock at an uncanny speed, and the staircase built out of the undead army took shape. Then some other undead soldiers began to move. About 100 even more magnificent undead. In their hands they clenched spears like lancers might hold, decorated with fabric, crimson cloth with the same crest stitched into each pennon. They stepped now into the marsh in perfect alignment, crimson capes fluttering behind them. They proceeded without speaking, crunching the ice under their feet. They really were in perfect order, maintaining their intervals as they advanced across the marsh, then crossing their lances with the warriors opposite them. The alternating lances formed a corridor leading up the rock.
A path for the king?
Zenbel was exactly right. The caster of death stepped into the corridor of undead. No one knew when the figures following him had appeared. In front stood the caster, whose power was now impossible to fathom. He was clad in a robe so black it appeared to be cut from darkness. The staff in his hand radiated a dark red aura. Inside it, anguished human faces would form, warp, and dissipate. The face beneath the hood was skeletal. A crimson color flickered in his vacant orbits. He was equipped with an abundance of magic accessories impossible for Zardayusu to comprehend, and walked forward with the majestic gait of a king. Attending slightly behind the King of Death was a woman in white. Her appearance was human-like, but a few things suggested otherwise, like the wings at her hips.
Could that be a demon?
Demons. A moniker that encompassed beings from the netherworld, such as fiends, which caused destruction with violence, and devils, which caused depravity with their wits. They were the height of wickedness. The purpose of their existence was to ruin every intelligent good person. In other words, these monsters were synonyms for evil. Zardayusu had heard of their kind on his travels, how horrible they were, how about 200 years ago a monster worthy of being called the King of Demons, an evil spirit, came with its underlings and nearly destroyed the world. In the end, the 13 heroes defeated them, and even now scars from that battle remained in some places. If undead were beings that hated the living, then demons existed to torment them. Behind the demon walked a pair of dark elf twins, followed by a silver-haired girl. Then came a strange monster that glided through the air, and finally a man like a human with a tail. The strange monster was the only one who didn't seem immensely powerful. All the others were enough to make the entire length of Zardayusu's tail quiver. His wild instincts were urging him, "Run away as fast as you can!" The party walked silently up the stairs beneath the pennons. They stepped on the undead soldiers with zero hesitation and ascended to the top of the giant rock like champions. The king of the dead at the front of the line moved his hands. Upon the sudden appearance of a tall throne that sparkled raven black, he sat down. The ones behind him, who appeared to be his aides, lined up and turned their gazes to the village as if they were watching for something, but they didn't do anything else.
What in the world is this?
A few lizardmen glanced at one another anxiously. They decided to leave the decision-making to the cleverest one present.
What should we do, Mr. Zariusu? Should we get ready to run?
The voice contained not the slightest will to fight. The lizardman's tail was drooping helplessly, speaking volumes for his internal state.
No need for that. Think back to the time with the Elder Lich. This caster seems way more powerful than that, right? He should have no problem ignoring this distance and unleashing an attack right now. He probably has something he wants to say.
The lizardman seemed to understand. Without taking his eyes off the advancing attendants, Zariusu continued observing the immensely powerful monster on top of the rock, as if he were one of the masses looking up at his king. He was determined not to miss a thing. At this distance, he was able to observe quite a lot of detail, and their eyes even met. Was the King of Death observing him too? The lack of hostility from the dark elves was surprising. The silver-haired girl had a smug grin. The demon was horrifying in how kind she seemed. He wasn't sure about the strange monster. He couldn't sense any emotion from the eyes of the man with the tail. After enough time had passed for them to observe each other, the King of Death once again brought his free hand up near his chest. Several lizardmen reacted by flailing their tails in distress.
Don't be afraid! Don't show the enemy that shameful display!
Zariusu's reprimand cut like a knife, and the lizardmen in the area all straightened. Multiple black hazes appeared before the King of Death, 20 to be exact. The swirling mists swelled to about 5 feet high. Before long, myriad faces had formed within them.
Those are...
Zariusu recalled the monster that had come to the villages, and the undead he'd encountered on his travels. He'd given a rough explanation back in Krush's village, how it was really only possible to damage this type of insubstantial monster by using enchanted weapons, weapons made of certain metals, magic, or certain martial arts. Even with all the lizard tribes put together, they had only a handful of magic weapons. In other words, it would be hard to take out even one of this particular type of undead, and their opponent could spawn 20 of them like it was nothing.
I guess that's what it means to be the ruler of death. I can see why that Elder Lich, who is plainly powerful in his own right, would devote himself completely to this being,
Zariusu thought, losing heart. The caster on the rock murmured something and waved his hand in a way that said, "Go." The undead flew to surround the village and said in unison,
"We relay the words of the Great One. The Great One would like to speak with you. The one who shall represent you will step forward immediately. Know that taking too long will only displease the Great One."
Upon making their declaration, the incorporeal monsters flew back to their creator and master.
Huh? The heck? That's all?
Zariusu's mouth gaped idiotically.
So he used those powerful undead just to tell us that?
But what he really couldn't believe was what happened at a signal from the ruler of death, when the silver-haired girl brought her hands swiftly together. The moment her hands connected, the hazy undead ceased to exist.
What?
Zariusu was so surprised he shouted in spite of himself. They hadn't returned the summoned monsters, but just wiped them out. Eliminating undead like that was something the priest class could do. Usually they had enough trouble just exorcising them, But with a big enough disparity in power, it was possible to annihilate them. But doing so to a large number would be much harder. In other words, the silver-haired girl was equal to the King of Death despite being his follower. The other followers lined up with her were probably just as powerful. Sarayusu couldn't stop laughing. Of course he couldn't. What else was there to do but laugh? This stark power imbalance was just...
Sarayusu!
Oh, brother! Hearing the voice from below the wall, Sarayusu looked down to find Shishoryu and Krush. They climbed up and examined the caster's party. Krush crammed herself between Sarayusu and Zenbel. She nearly caused Zenbel to fall, but he decided to let it slide.
So that's the enemy boss. Just looking at him makes me start to expect a knife in the back. He looks like the Elder Lich you guys beat, but he's probably way stronger, huh? Did you finish on your end? Pretty much. Krush and I are both out of magical energy, and from what those messengers said, we have to take care of that first. About that, will you come with me?
For a few moments, Sarayusu just regarded Shishoryu in silence. Then he nodded emphatically. For a split second, Shishoryu made a pained expression, but before anyone else could notice, his usual face returned.
Sorry. No worries, brother.
With that, Shishoryu hopped off the wall. The thin ice over the marsh broke, and a splash rang out.
Okay, we're off.
Be careful.
Sarayusu gave Krush a tight hug, and then hopped down into the marsh after his brother. Sarayusu and Shishoryu walked over, crunching through the ice. As they exited the village gate, Sarayusu felt the King of Death's gaze on them, as if it exerted physical pressure. And from behind he sensed concerned looks. The strongest one must have belonged to Krush. He desperately suppressed the intense emotions that made him ache with longing. Abruptly breaking their silence, Shishoryu spoke.
Sorry. Why, brother? Because if this talk goes badly, we're sure to be killed as an example.
Sarayusu knew that. That was why he'd squeezed Krush so tightly.
Considering how many of them there are, I couldn't let you go alone. Besides, they'd probably think we were making light of them if we only sent one.
Sarayusu was a Lizardman, people knew, and an appropriate second for the dialogue. But caste-wise, he was a traveler. If he were killed, it wouldn't greatly affect Lizardman solidarity. Even if a hero died, as long as the chiefs were still around, the Lizardmen could fight. It would be a shame if they lost Frostpain, but he couldn't have left it behind. He needed it to withstand the chill coming off the frozen lake. The pair walked in silence, one step, then another, closer to death. When they reached the bottom of the undead stairs leading to the throne, they called out. If the throne had been set back from the edge, they might have gone up, but since there was no room for them, it probably wasn't the King of Death's intention to have them climb the stairs. The king would stand on higher ground. Lizardmen didn't have the custom that many other races had, that superiors should be elevated. Of course, considering they'd come for a discussion, one could say this treatment was rude. In other words, it could mean only that their enemy had called them there under the guise of a dialogue, but had absolutely zero interest in talking to them. But it really was presumptuous of them to expect equal treatment. Certainly Sarayusu and the others had won the previous battle, but one look at the enemies lined up on that rock, and they had to admit, even if they didn't like it, that their win was meaningless. It had been nothing more than child's play.
Here we are! I am the representative of the Lizardmen, Shishoryu Shasha, and this is the strongest Lizardman. Sarayusu Shasha!
Still, there was no sense from their voices that they were trying to curry favor. They knew it was foolish. It was their last bit of pride. That battle may have been child's play to their enemy, but they couldn't let the pride of the warriors who had died be for nothing. There was no reply. The king on his throne only gave them an openly appraising once over. There was no sign of movement. The one who answered was the demon with black wings sprouting from her hips.
Our master doesn't believe you're in the appropriate posture to hear him speak.
What?
In response to their confusion, the woman called to the one like a man with a tail, who was standing next to her.
Demiurge!
You will bow down.
Suddenly, Zardiusu and Shishuryu got down on their knees and plunged their heads into the muddy marsh. They couldn't help but think it was the right thing to do. Frigid, muddy water clung to their bodies, and the broken ice refroze. They essentially couldn't get back up. No matter how much strength they put into moving, they didn't budge. Their bodies were robbed of all freedom, as if a giant invisible hand were pressing down on them from above.
Don't struggle.
The moment this second command reached their ears, somewhere in both Zardiusu and Shishuryu, a new brain grew, one that would listen to someone else's orders, and they sensed themselves moving according to it. Seeing the two weakened lizardmen bowing humiliatingly into the mud, the demon lady seemed satisfied and spoke to her master.
Lord Ainz, it appears they've assumed the listening posture.
Thanks. Raise your heads. You are permitted to raise your heads.
Moving the only part of their bodies that they could freely, Zardiusu and Shishuryu looked up as if in awe of his supremeness.
I am the ruler of the great tomb of Nazarick, Ainzul Gon. I offer you my thanks for assisting with that experiment earlier.
Experiment? We lost that many of our friends, and he calls it an experiment?
Violent emotion at the horror of it blazed up as a flame in Zardiusu's heart, but he held it back. It was still too soon.
Now then, what I'd like to discuss is you entering under our rule.
Shishuryu was about to say something, but the caster Ainz stopped him by raising a hand slightly. Realizing nothing good would come of ignoring him and speaking, Shishuryu obediently kept quiet.
But I'm sure you don't want to be ruled by the army you just defeated in battle. So, we're going to attack you again in 4 hours. If you can claim victory yet again, I promise to withdraw entirely. I'll even pay an adequate amount of reparations.
May I ask a question?
That's fine. Ask away.
Will the one attacking be you, Sir Gon?
The silver-haired girl behind him moved her eyebrows slightly, and the lady demon's smile intensified. Perhaps they didn't feel the address was up to their master's level. The reason they didn't do anything about it must have been because he didn't respond. Paying no attention to them, Ainz continued.
Ha! No. The one attacking is a trusted aide of mine. Just one man. His name is Cocytus.
Hearing that, Zardiusu was assaulted by despair, as if the world were crumbling. If the enemy were going to attack in numbers, the lizardmen might have had a chance. That is, maybe it would have been more of the same unpleasant army from the day before. In that case, they would have had a slim chance of winning, but that chance was gone. It would be a solo attacker. An army that had lost once already, after displaying this much force, would send a single man to attack? Unless it was some kind of punishment for the attacker in question, they had complete faith in him. Someone a being with unfathomable power trusted. There was only one thing that person could be, another unfathomable power, such that the lizardmen stood no chance of winning.
We'll surrender. Don't be boring and say you'll surrender before you've even fought. Come on, let's fight a bit. We'd like to taste a proper victory.
As if robbing Shishoryu of his words, Ainz crushed the end of his sentence.
In short, you mean to make an example of us, you scum?
Zaryusu snapped in his head. As the stronger power, they would expunge the reality of their loss with a massacre. In other words, what was about to occur was ritual sacrifice, nothing less than a trampling of the Lizardmen in order to rob them completely of their will to rebel.
That's all I wanted to discuss. I'll be watching in 4 hours, so make it entertaining. Please, wait! Will this ice melt?
Win or lose, it would be brutal for the Lizardmen to live on the frozen lake.
Oh, right.
He'd forgotten. His tone was that flippant.
I just didn't want to get all muddy walking in the marsh.
Once we get back to the other side,
I'll cancel the spell's effects.
What? Both Zaryusu and Shishoryu gasped in shock, unable to believe their ears. He froze it because he didn't want to get muddy. The expression, "this can't be," wasn't nearly strong enough. The power imbalance was too great. This was a being who could bend the powers of nature like it was nothing, and for any stupid whim he wished.
This is who we've been up against?
Both Zaryusu and Shishoryu were assailed by the fear of lost children.
All right. Farewell, Lizardmen. Gate.
Having said everything he'd come to say, Ainz waved his hand slightly. A hemisphere of darkness appeared before the throne, and he disappeared into it. "Goodbye, Lizardmen."
Later, Lizardmans. Fare ye well, Lizardmen.
The 2 women and single boy who had been in attendance addressed them disinterestedly and followed their master into the darkness.
Well, take care. Eggshell, teal, clay ebony, cinnabar, lime white.
Well then, goodbye. The dark elf girl and the strange monster were swallowed up by the darkness.
You may go free. Well, give us some fun, Lizardmen.
The man with the tail was the last to disappear, and when his gentle voice echoed out, the weights holding down the pair of Lizardmen melted away. Left suddenly alone, still prostrate in the mud, Zaryusu and Shishoryu no longer had the energy to rise. The freezing chill of the marsh didn't even bother them anymore. The shock to their minds was far more intense.
Damn it.
An uncharacteristic utterance coming from Shishoryu. It contained a mixture of emotions. When Zaryusu and Shishoryu returned, the chiefs of each tribe, who had climbed up on the mud walls to evade the ice, were there to meet them. There were no other Lizardmen in the area. They'd probably figured they would need to discuss in secret, so Shishoryu probably thought he didn't need to hide anything. He spoke frankly, relaying every last detail of the so-called discussion. There was no big reaction to his heavy tale. Everyone's breath just caught slightly. They had probably guessed what sort of negotiations would take place.
Got it. And what about the ice? We can't fight if it doesn't melt. That won't be a problem. He said he would cancel the spell. That's what you got out of the negotiations, huh?
Shishoryu just smiled faintly in response to the Small Fang tribe chief's question. Comprehending his meaning, the chief cheerlessly shook his head.
While you were out, we did some investigating, you see, and there are enemies inside the lake. They look like skeleton soldiers. It seems like they're standing by in positions surrounding the village. No. Let escape. So they're really serious about this. I guess so.
The 4 who hadn't met the ruler sighed. Perhaps they had also arrived at the conclusion that it would be a ritual sacrifice.
Well, what'll we do? Mobilize all warriors, as well as everyone here. Brother, could we do it with just 5?
Keeping a slightly confused Krush in his field of vision, Zaryusu continued his petition to not only Shishoryu, but also all the males.
Their intention is to put on a show of their overwhelming power, so I doubt they'll kill us all. If that's the case, then we'll need a leader to unite the survivors. If you think about the future of lizard mankind, it would be a waste for all of us here to die.
Two chiefs looked between Zaryusu and Krush and voiced their agreement.
He's right, don't you think, Shishoryu? Yes, Zaryusu. True.
Then, having gotten Zenbel's approval,
Sounds good. Fine by me.
Shishoryu no longer had any reason to veto his brother's wishes.
Okay, let's do that. Someone needs to survive and lead the tribe. I was thinking that as well. Krush is the right person for the job. Being an albino might be a minus, but her priest skills will be indispensable.
Wait just a minute! I'm going to fight with you!
Krush shouted, wondering why they were leaving her behind so late in the game.
Besides, if someone's going to stay behind, wouldn't Shishoryu be better? He's the chief everyone trusts the most.
That's why he's no good. Their intention is to show us their overwhelming power. They're probably aiming to make us lose heart so they can conquer us easier. So if there was a lizard man left alive who gave everyone hope... And out of all us chiefs and so on here, you actually have the worst reputation.
Krush didn't know what to say. It was the undeniable truth that she, the albino, was least popular.
Convincing them with words will be impossible,
she thought, and turned to Zaryusu.
I'm going with you. Didn't you have me resign myself when you called me to follow you here? And now you're going to tell me this?
Back then, depending on the situation, everyone might have died. But now it seems like one of us will be able to make it.
Don't give me that!
The air seemed to crackle with Krush's anger. Several strikes sounded against the mud wall. The intense emotion was making her tail go out of control.
Zaryusu, you convince her. See you in 4 hours.
With that, Shishoryu walked off. Following a moment later were the crack of breaking ice and some splashes. The other 3 chiefs had hopped off the wall and gone with him. Zenbel raised a hand in a slight wave without turning around. After watching them go, Zaryusu turned back to Krush.
Krush, please understand.
How can I? Plus, there's nothing to say for sure that we'll lose. With my priest powers, we might be able to win.
How empty those words sounded. Not even Krush herself believed them.
I don't want to send the female I love to her death. Please, just grant this foolish male's wish.
Krush embraced him, visibly heartbroken.
That was a dirty move.
Sorry.
You're probably going to die.
Yeah.
That was true. The chance of his survival was low. No, probably just non-existent.
In only a week's time, you stole my heart, and now you're telling me to just see you off?
Yeah.
I'm so glad I met you, but it was also horrible luck.
Krush's arms tightened around Zaryusu's back, as if to say she didn't want them to ever part. Zaryusu had no words.
What should I say? What can I say to make it okay?
These thoughts tormented him. After a little while, Krush looked up. Her face was full of determination. He was worried what she would say. He was worried she would say she was going with him no matter what. Instead, she made a clear declaration.
I'm gonna get pregnant.
What?
Let's go.